The elixir had taken him to the edges of the world before. The jungles of the Congo where no trail existed until he made one. The Siberian tundra where wolves ran in packs of 40 and still fled his scent on the wind. The savage land, where creatures that had no business still breathing walked the earth like gods of an older age. Sergei Kravenov had hunted every corner of the planet and found each one, eventually, too small, too known, too thoroughly conquered by the one predator the world had never learned to contain. He had not expected the elixir to answer that hunger so literally. The ritual had been a mistake, or perhaps it had been exactly what it was meant to be. A batch of the root sourced from corrupted Wakandan soil, I prepared in haste after a hunt in the Serengeti, left him restless and hollow, in the way only a perfect kill could leave him. He had performed the ceremony in a stone circle north of Nairobi under a sky full of indifferent stars, and the world had simply opened. Not with thunder or divine declaration, with the quiet, absolute finality of a trap springing shut. One breath in his world, the next breath somewhere else entirely. He came down in Georgia. He knew it was Georgia by the trees, the particular lean of loblolly pine in summer heat, kudzu swallowing fences whole, the red clay earth showing through cracked asphalt like an old wound refusing to close. He knew something was catastrophically wrong with Georgia by everything else. The silence where highways should have had noise, and the smell, copper rot and decay so dense it coated the back of his throat like oil. 3 dead things shambling along the road below the embankment where he'd landed, moving with the graceless certainty of creatures that had forgotten what direction meant but hadn't forgotten how to want. Kraven watched them for 4 minutes without moving. He was a man who understood, at a cellular level, the grammar of predator and prey. The way a hunting cat's shoulder drops before the lunge. The microsecond of weight transfer that precedes violence in any living thing. These 3 had none of it. They moved through the world like water filling a container. Shapeless, patient, without intent in any meaningful sense. Their eyes were filmed milky white. Their mouths worked at the air. One had lost its left arm at the elbow and seemed entirely unbothered by the absence. They cannot be hunted, he understood immediately, because they are not truly alive. He dropped from the embankment in one fluid motion, landed in the dry grass without sound, and broke the nearest one's skull with his forearm in a single sweeping strike before it could turn fully toward him. The second he caught by the jaw and snapped backward. The third he allowed to reach him, studying its grip, its bite radius, the specific desperation in its grasping hands, before driving his thumb through its temple with the precise, unhurried economy of a man filing paperwork. He wiped his hand on the dead grass and looked at what the world had become. Interesting, Kraven thought. And then, beneath that, with the particular hollowness of a man who has wanted one thing his entire life and finds it missing. There is nothing here worth killing. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. He moved through the Georgia heat with a hunter's economy, burning no energy that wasn't necessary, cataloging everything his senses brought him. The decay smell was everywhere, which meant the dead were everywhere, which told him civilization had not merely stumbled here but had been comprehensively erased. He found a gas station with its windows punched inward, the racks of snacks long since stripped, like a hand-drawn map someone had taped to the counter before they either fled or stopped needing maps. He studied it without touching it. Kraven the hunter had never needed to write down a landscape he'd walked through once. He carried terrain in his body the way other men carried memory. The map showed a town called Woodbury, circled in red marker with the word avoid, written in capital letters and underlined twice. 12 miles east of his position. It showed a highway leading north toward what had once been a state correctional facility. The notation beside it too smeared to read, but accompanied by a small, careful drawing of a fence. People. Surviving people. Which meant living people. Which meant the only creatures in this ruined world that still possessed the capacity to think, to plan, to fear, and to fight back. Kraven folded the map into his vest pocket without deciding anything. He simply turned north and began to walk, moving through the afternoon heat with the unhurried certainty of a man who has never once in his life been lost. Behind him, the three he'd killed lay still in the grass. Somewhere beyond the tree line, more of the dead moved through the kudzu, drawn by sounds that no longer existed toward the memory of what noise had once meant. The Georgia sky was enormous and white with summer haze, and nothing in it acknowledged Sergei Kravanov's arrival. The world was dead, and he was not. For now, that would have to be enough. Rick Grimes had developed a specific sensitivity to wrong things. It wasn't intuition in any mystical sense. It was the accumulated scar tissue of 2 years spent learning that the world's new language was threat. And that fluency in that language was the only thing keeping his people breathing. He'd learned to read wrongness in the way a herd moved, in the specific silence that preceded an ambush, in the particular quality of stillness that meant a building wasn't empty the way it appeared to be empty. He'd earned every instinct through loss, and he spent them carefully. The man walking out of the tree line at the prison's southern perimeter registered as wrong before Rick could articulate why. It wasn't the weapons, though the arsenal the stranger carried was extraordinary, a hunter's collection of handcrafted tools that sat on his body with the ease of things that had lived there for years. It wasn't the size of him, though he was large in the way that suggested the size was entirely functional, not ornamental. It was the way he moved. And every man Rick had encountered in the 2 years since the world ended moved with some degree of the apocalypse's particular damage. The perpetual alertness that shaded into flinch. The way survivors carried their shoulders like they were braced for impact they'd already received 100 times. Even the most hardened men in the prison yard carried that weight. This man did not. He walked toward the fence with the calm of someone approaching a property line he'd already decided to cross, his dark eyes moving across the prison's perimeter in a single, unhurried sweep that cataloged everything Rick had spent months building. The watchtowers, the kill zone, the inner fence's reinforced sections. He read it all in approximately 4 seconds and seemed neither impressed nor deterred. Maggie saw him first from the guard tower and had her rifle up before Rick reached the fence. Daryl materialized from somewhere to Rick's left with his crossbow already at his shoulder, which was the closest thing to a standing ovation Daryl Dixon offered anything. "That's close enough," Rick called. The man stopped exactly where he'd already decided to stop, which happened to be just outside effective pistol range. That was not coincidence, Rick understood. This was a man who calculated distance the way Rick calculated threat. "You have a perimeter walker," the stranger said. His voice carried a slight accent. Eastern European, Rick thought, though he couldn't place it precisely. "Southeastern corner. It has become caught in the fence wire and the sound will draw others within the hour. I mention this as a courtesy." Rick kept his expression neutral. Beside him he heard Daryl exhale slowly. Not fear, but the specific recalibration of someone who'd just received information they needed to take seriously. "Who are you?" Rick asked. "My name is Sergei Kravenov." A pause, as though he were deciding how much of the rest to offer. "I arrived in your state 3 days ago under circumstances I am still accounting for. I have been observing your settlement for approximately 6 hours. You have 41 people inside this fence, 3 of whom are children. Your watch rotation has a 17-minute gap on the northwest corner between the second and third shift change. I tell you this also as a courtesy." The silence that followed was the specific silence of people recalculating. "You've been watching us for 6 hours, Rick said. I considered approaching sooner. I wanted to understand what I was approaching first." He said it without apology, without aggression. Simply as fact, the way a man reports weather. "I am not sick. I am not affiliated with any group in this region that I am aware of. I require nothing from you. Not shelter, not food, not protection. I am telling you I exist because in my experience, people who discover they have been observed without their knowledge react with significantly more hostility than people who are told directly." Rick looked at Daryl. Daryl looked at Rick. 26 months of surviving the end of everything had built between them a conversational shorthand that required no words. And what passed between them now was something like, "I have no idea what this is." They let him in through the outer gate, weapons trained, Carol watching from the catwalk with the particular stillness she'd developed since the world ended, which was its own kind of terrifying to anyone paying attention. Glenn tracked Kravinoff's hands. Herschel watched from the cell block door with his one leg and the expression of a man who had learned to read character because he'd lost the luxury of reading circumstance. Kravinoff submitted to the search without complaint and without the barely concealed resentment that most men showed when their weapons were handled by someone else. He watched Rick's hands work through his gear with what appeared to be professional interest, evaluating the search technique, Rick realized, with the detached appreciation of one expert observing another. The knives, Rick said, are holding up a blade that had no business existing in a sporting goods store. Hand-forged, the edge geometry unlike anything manufactured. You made these. Some of them. Who taught you? Kravinoff's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. Different teachers for different things. A Zulu weapons, smith in KwaZulu-Natal for the blades, a Siberian trapper for the snares, a man in the Amazon whose name I was never given for the compound poisons. He paused. I have spent my life learning from the best practitioners of every discipline I considered worth mastering. And what discipline is that exactly? Rick asked. Kravinoff looked at him with dark eyes that held the particular quality of deep water, calm on the surface, with no visible bottom. Finding things, he said, and understanding them completely. That night, Rick sat awake long after the prison went quiet, turning the answer over in his mind. Herschel had pulled him aside before lights out and said, in the measured way Herschel said things that mattered, "That man has never been afraid of anything in his life. I don't know yet if that makes him useful or dangerous." Rick had nodded and said nothing, because the honest answer was that in his experience, those two things were rarely as different as people hoped. He had hunted lions on the Serengeti at midnight. He had tracked a wounded Cape buffalo through 16 kilometers of dense bush, alone, without losing the thread of its passage for a single moment. He had descended into a Philippine cave system to find a species of blind predatory fish that no biologist had catalogued. I studied it for 3 days by touch and sound alone, and emerged with an understanding of its hunting methodology that he could reproduce from memory a decade later. Sergei Kravinoff had given his life to the study of predation in every form the natural world had invented, and he had never once encountered a prey animal that did not, on some fundamental level, know it was being hunted. Fear was the river that ran beneath every hunt. The prey's awareness of the predator's existence was what gave the chase its meaning, its tension, its truth. A trap that catches an animal unaware is mechanics. A hunt where the prey knows and runs anyway, that is philosophy. The walkers did not know. He had spent 3 days ranging out from the prison in expanding circles, studying them with the same methodical attention he'd given to every new environment he'd ever entered. He catalogued their movement patterns, drawn to sound, secondarily to motion, with a sensory range roughly equivalent to a human with severe neurological damage. They did not sleep. They did not tire in any conventional sense, though their physical deterioration was continuous and cumulative. A fresh walker moved faster than one 6 months dead. A walker with intact legs was more dangerous than one dragging a fracture. These were meaningful distinctions, the kind a hunter filed away automatically. But they held no fear. He tested this on the 4th morning, deliberately making himself visible to a group of 11 moving through an overgrown parking lot south of the prison. He stood in the open, in clear sightline, and watched them register his presence. They turned toward him with that characteristic graceless pivot, mouths working, and moved in his direction with the absolute conviction of things that had no concept of risk. There was no hesitation, no assessment, no moment where a living creature's nervous system fires the signal that says, "This thing might kill me. Recalculate." They came because he existed, and he was warm, and that was the entirety of their decision-making architecture. Kraven dispatched all 11 in 4 minutes and stood among them in the morning heat, breathing slowly, feeling something he hadn't felt since childhood and didn't have a comfortable name for. Disappointed was too small. Bereft was closer. He returned to the prison before the Southwest Watch rotation and found Daryl Dixon sitting on an overturned milk crate outside the inner fence, fletching a bolt with the focused quiet of a man who worked best when no one was speaking to him. Kraven sat down on the concrete, 12 feet away without being invited, and watched the work. Daryl didn't look up. He didn't tense, either, which was its own form of acknowledgement. The man was aware of Kraven's approach from a distance and had chosen not to perform surprise. That was interesting. "You've been out there every morning," Daryl said. Not accusatory, observational. "Yes." "Studying them." "Yes." Daryl ran the fletching through his fingers, checking the adhesion. "Figure anything useful out?" Kraven considered the question seriously, which was the only way he knew how to consider questions. "They are drawn to sound before movement. A low-frequency sound at distance will redirect a group faster than visual stimulus at close range. Their bite pressure is roughly equivalent to a large dog. Dangerous at the throat and wrist, manageable elsewhere if you understand leverage." He paused. "They are also, as prey, entirely without value." Daryl looked up at that. His eyes were sharp in the way that outdoor men's eyes tended to be sharp. Not educated sharpness, but the earned kind. The kind that comes from years of reading landscape and weather and animal sign. "Most people here would disagree with you. Walkers kill people every day." "Dangerous is not the same as worthy," Kraven said. "A landmine is dangerous. You do not hunt a landmine. You navigate it." He picked up a stone from the ground and turned it in his fingers. "These creatures represent the end of everything that made this world interesting to me. They do not choose. They do not adapt. They do not learn from failure because they cannot recognize failure. They are a force of nature wearing the shape of men, and forces of nature cannot be hunted, only survived." Daryl was quiet for a moment. A raven, an actual living raven, black and glossy and absurdly vital against the gray morning, landed on the fence post above them, regarded them both with one amber eye, and departed. "So, what are you going to do?" Daryl asked. "I am going to determine whether there is anything in this world worth the effort of remaining in it," Kraven said. "So far I have found one candidate." Daryl's eyes narrowed slightly. "Like the walkers, aren't it?" "No." Kraven looked toward the prison block where, through a narrow window, he could see the pale rectangle of a child's drawing taped to the glass. Something with 4 legs that might have been a horse or might have been a large dog, rendered in crayon with the specific fearless inaccuracy of a very young child. "The walkers are the landscape. What I am looking for is what survives inside the landscape. What adapts. What continues to choose despite every pressure to stop choosing." He set the stone down. "Your people make choices every day that most humans in comfort would consider impossible. That is not nothing." He stood, brushing concrete dust from his vest. "There is also," he added, almost as an afterthought, "the man in Woodbury." Daryl went very still in the way prey animals go still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of every system simultaneously realigning toward a single point of focus. "What do you know about Woodbury?" "Enough," Kraven said, "to know that whatever he is not a force of nature." He walked back toward the cell block without elaborating, and behind him, Daryl Dixon sat motionless for a long moment before reaching for his radio. The governor's name was Philip Blake, though almost no one who mattered called him that anymore. He had built Woodbury on a specific philosophy, one he'd arrived at through the kind of experiential education that leaves no academic record and considerable psychological wreckage. The philosophy was simple. In a world where the dead walked, the living were the only meaningful currency, and currency existed to be spent. He'd spent people on Woodbury's walls, on its arena, on the particular theater of controlled brutality that kept his population frightened enough to be manageable and entertained enough not to think too carefully about what they were frightened of. He was a student of human weakness in the way that genuinely dangerous men tend to be, not through malice alone, but through the colder, more patient instrumentality of someone who had discovered that understanding what people needed was the most reliable way to ensure they never got enough of it to become independent. His informants were everywhere. That was the first thing he'd built, before the walls, before the arena. The network of eyes that kept him oriented in a landscape where information was the only resource that didn't rot. One of those eyes came to him on a Tuesday morning in early October with a report that Philip Blake filed immediately under the category of things requiring his complete and undivided attention. He came out of nowhere, the informant said. His name was Martinez, and he was one of the governor's more reliable assets. Practical, unromantic about violence, possessed of the useful quality of reporting what he'd seen rather than what he thought the governor wanted to hear. Nobody in the area has claimed him. He's not from any group we know. He walked out of the trees at the prison like he'd been dropped there. Description: big. Not fat big, functional big. Carries more blades than any man needs, a spear, what looks like handmade equipment throughout. Moves like... Martinez paused, choosing words carefully. Like he doesn't think anything out there is going to hurt him. Not in a stupid way. In a way that makes you think maybe he's right. The governor was quiet for a moment. Through the window of his apartment, the best apartment in Woodbury, which was not coincidental, he could see the arena floor where two men were cleaning up after last night's entertainment. The morning light was thin and gray, autumn finally pushing summer out of the Georgia sky. And Rick's people took him in? Provisionally. He's not in a cell, but he's not fully trusted either. He goes out every morning alone and comes back. They let him. They let him, the governor repeated softly, with the particular emphasis of a man noting an error in someone else's calculation. He spent the rest of the morning thinking about the stranger with the unhurried quality that characterized his best strategic work. Not urgent, not reactive, but thorough in the way that a man is thorough when he intends to have no surprises. By afternoon, he'd constructed 3 possible approaches, evaluated each against what Martinez had given him, and discarded 2. The third he kept because it was the only one that accounted for the variable he found most interesting. A man who had walked out of nowhere into the middle of the apocalypse and appeared, by Martinez's account, to be entirely comfortable there. Such men were rare. Rare things, in Philip Blake's experience, were either weapons or threats, and the determining factor was always whether you reached them first. He sent a message through back channels, not a Raven, not a runner, nothing that could be intercepted and read back to Rick Grimes with its sender identified. A verbal message passed through 2 intermediaries, arriving at the prison's outer fence in the mouth of a trader who came weekly with small goods and smaller information. The message was brief. The man who arrived recently. Tell him there are things in this region worth knowing. Tell him Woodbury is where the knowing happens. Tell him Philip invites him as a guest, freely, with no obligation attached. The trader delivered it to Kraven directly, bypassing Rick entirely, in which was intentional. The governor wanted to see whether the stranger would tell Rick about the approach or whether he'd process it as his own information to manage. Either answer was useful. A man who reported the contact was cautious and group-oriented. A man who didn't was independent and potentially acquirable. Kraven told Rick about it that same evening. He did it the way he did most things, directly, without preamble, in the middle of the prison's common area while Rick was going over the watch schedule with Daryl and Herschel. He set the trader's words out plainly, including the specific phrasing, and watched Rick's face move through several calculations in rapid succession before settling into the careful neutrality that Kraven had identified as Rick's default mode for situations he hadn't yet fully categorized. He reached you through the trader, Rick said. Not through us. Yes. That was deliberate. Everything that man does is deliberate, Kraven said. The message itself is less interesting than its delivery mechanism. He wanted to know how I would handle receiving it. He is evaluating me. And you're going? Daryl asked. His tone carried no judgment, only the flat factual quality of a man who needed accurate information to plan around. Kraven looked at Rick. I will go if you want me to go. I will stay if you want me to stay. I have no loyalty to Philip Blake and no debt to collect from him. But I have been in this world for 11 days, and there is one creature in it that I have not yet been able to fully read from a distance. He paused. Yeah, a man who builds a kingdom on fear and keeps it functioning through theater is not a simple thing. Simple things do not interest me. Herschel spoke from the doorway, his voice carrying the weighted quietness it always carried when he'd been listening longer than anyone realized. What does interest you, Mr. Kravinoff? Kraven was silent for a moment that felt considered rather than hesitant. Predators, he said, and whether this one knows what he is. Woodbury was a performance. Kraven understood this within 4 minutes of passing through its gates, which were opened for him with the particular theatricality of a welcome that had been choreographed in advance. The walls were real, constructed with genuine engineering competence, maintained with disciplined regularity. The guards were real, armed and positioned with tactical logic that suggested someone with actual military experience had designed the rotation. The people moving through Woodbury streets were real, going about the reduced but functional business of apocalypse survival, with the slightly too normal quality of people who had been instructed to appear slightly too normal. The performance was everything layered beneath that reality. The way the gate guards stood a fraction too straight when they opened for him, aware they were being observed by someone above and behind Kraven's sightline, a window, second floor, southeastern corner of the main building. The way the street traffic flowed around him with the unconscious choreography of people accustomed to making way for guests the governor had flagged as significant. The arena, or which he passed on the way in and which smelled of old blood and sawdust and the specific animal desperation of crowds that have been taught to want what they're given. That was the performance's thesis statement, its architectural declaration of what Philip Blake believed people fundamentally were. The man himself was waiting in a room that managed to feel like an office, despite the absence of everything that had previously made offices meaningful. A desk, 2 chairs, a window with actual glass, intact, looking out over Woodbury's main street. And the governor, who stood rather than sat. Another calculation, Kraven noted, the choice to receive a guest from a standing position, denying the subtle dominance of height above while projecting the energy of a man too engaged with the world to be sedentary. He had one eye. The other was covered, and Kraven did not make the mistake of assuming the covering was vanity. In his experience, men who displayed their damage openly were either broken by it or had decided to make it part of their weaponry. Philip Blake's remaining eye suggested the latter with considerable force. It was the eye of a man who had looked at the world's worst possibilities and decided they were workable. Sergei Kravenov, the governor said, extending his hand. I appreciate you making the trip. You made it easy to find, Kraven said, shaking the hand and cataloging the grip in the same motion. Strong, controlled, deliberately calibrated to communicate confidence without aggression. A politician's handshake on a warlord's body. Sit down, ye please. The governor settled into the chair behind his desk with the ease of a man who had engineered this room to make sitting behind that desk feel natural and necessary. I'll skip the part where I pretend I don't know things. I know you arrived about 11 days ago from no direction anyone can account for. I know Rick Grimes has given you provisional shelter without fully trusting you, which is very Rick. He's a man who extends good faith as a first principle, and then spends the following weeks figuring out whether it was deserved. I know you've been going out every morning to study the walkers, and I know you've been watching my town from the tree line on 2 separate occasions before you agreed to come here. He said all of this pleasantly, without emphasis, as though reading a grocery list. You have capable informants, Kraven said. I have necessary informants. There's a distinction. The governor leaned forward slightly, his elbows finding the desk with the comfortable familiarity of a habitual posture. I'll also tell you what I think, because I've found that directness saves time with men of a certain type, and you are very clearly a man of a certain type. He paused. I think you're the most dangerous human being within 200 miles of this spot. I think you arrived here from somewhere that doesn't map onto any geography I can account for. And I think you haven't decided yet what this world is worth to you. I think Rick Grimes is hoping you'll become an asset and is quietly terrified you'll become a problem. And I think you find his particular brand of principled anxiety somewhat tedious. Kraven studied him across the desk. The afternoon light came through the window and caught the dust motes between them, tiny, slow planets in a dying solar system. And what do you think I should become? Kraven asked. The governor smiled. It was a good smile. Warm, practiced, containing within its warmth the specific coldness of a smile that had been constructed rather than felt. I think you should become whoever you already are, and I think you should do it here, where it's appreciated. He spread his hands. Rick's prison is a rescue operation dressed up as a community. He's keeping people alive, which is admirable, but he's doing it according to a moral framework that the world stopped supporting about 2 years ago. He still believes in laws, in rights, in the idea that survival and decency can coexist without one cannibalizing the other. He paused. You don't believe that. You don't know what I believe. I know what you are. What you are doesn't believe in rescue operations. The governor's voice carried no contempt. That was the sophisticated part, the part that made him genuinely dangerous. He wasn't dismissing Rick's framework. He was presenting himself as the realist alternative to it, the man who had looked at the truth clearly and built something functional on top of it rather than pretending. A man like you in a world like this needs a context that matches his actual nature, not a community that will eventually ask him to be smaller than he is. Kraven was quiet for a long moment. Outside, Woodbury's performance continued. Voices, movement, the mundane percussion of people going through the motions of normalcy. From somewhere deeper in the building came a sound that didn't fit the performance. Low, rhythmic, the sound of someone in sustained distress who had learned to keep the volume manageable. Kraven's eyes moved to the interior wall, then back to the governor. "Tell me about the arena," he said. Something shifted almost imperceptibly behind the governor's remaining eye. A microsecond of recalibration, quickly recovered. "Entertainment. People need it. Controlled danger is better than uncontrolled fear. It gives the fear somewhere to go. You put living people in it. Volunteers," the governor said smoothly. "No," Kraven said, with the flat certainty of a man who has studied the body language of captivity in a dozen species and recognizes the posture immediately. They are not volunteers." The smile remained. But something behind it had gone still in the way that things go still before they move very fast. "You're a hunter, Mr. Kravinoff," the governor said softly. "You understand that in any ecosystem, the strong define the terms for the weak. That's not cruelty. That's ecology." Kraven looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way he read everything, completely, down to the substrate. "I understand ecology perfectly," Kraven said. "What I am considering is whether you do." He stood, thanked the governor for his hospitality with the formal courtesy that his upbringing had made automatic, regardless of circumstances, and walked out of Woodbury through the same gates he'd entered. He did not tell Rick everything he'd seen. Not yet. Some information was only useful once, and Kraven had not yet decided exactly how to spend it. He made the decision on a Wednesday, in the gray pre-dawn hour when the prison was at its quietest, and the walkers along the southern fence moved through the mist like thoughts a sleeping mind couldn't quite complete. It was not a good decision. He understood that with the clear-eyed precision he brought to every calculation. It was a necessary decision, which was a different thing entirely. And the difference was the specific moral weight that separated a man who did difficult things because they were easy from a man who did them because the alternative cost more than he was willing to spend on someone else's behalf. Kraven had spent his entire life in the first category. What troubled him, sitting on the concrete in the cold morning with the mist moving through the fence wire, it was the growing suspicion that he was migrating toward the second. The governor was going to attack the prison. This was not speculation. During his visit to Woodbury, he had read the inventory of Philip Blake's preparations, the way he read track sign in fresh mud. Not through any single piece of evidence, but through the accumulation of small details that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. The vehicle fuel stored in quantities beyond daily need. The ammunition organized by caliber with the specific efficiency of pre-engagement preparation rather than routine maintenance. The wall guards whose eyes moved outward with more frequency than inward, not watching for walkers approaching Woodbury but measuring distance toward something beyond it. And Martinez, who had been present for part of Kraven's visit and whose body language carried the compressed readiness of a man counting down to something he'd been briefed on. The attack was coming within 2 weeks. Possibly sooner. The straightforward response was to tell Rick immediately, completely, and let the prison's leadership make informed decisions about fortification and contingency. Kraven had considered this. He'd considered it seriously, turning it over for 3 days with the methodical patience of a hunter evaluating approach vectors. The problem with the straightforward response was that it produced a straightforward outcome. Rick would fortify, the governor would observe the fortification through his informant network, and he would adjust accordingly. A warned enemy against a prepared defense became a siege, and a siege meant attrition. and attrition meant the prison's children and its elderly and its wounded ground, down by weeks of sustained pressure until something critical gave way. The governor needed to believe his attack would find what he expected to find, which meant someone needed to give him a reason to move before he was fully ready. Kraven spent one more day watching the traders' routes in and out of the prison, mapping the specific rhythm of information flow between Woodbury's network and Rick's perimeter. He identified the informant on the third day, not Martinez, who was too valuable to risk on routine intelligence, but a woman named Clara, who traded preserved food for medical supplies and whose eyes spent slightly too long on the guard rotation schedule posted inside the inner gate. She wasn't malicious, he decided. Honestly, she was frightened, and frightened people made terrible choices for comprehensible reasons, which made them useful and pitiable in roughly equal measure. He approached her on the Thursday morning as she was preparing to leave, in the narrow corridor between the outer and inner gates where the camera angles from both watchtowers created a blind spot he had identified on his second day at the prison. He did it quietly, without theater, stepping into her path with the simple physical fact of his presence. She went still in the way prey animals go still. "I know what you're doing," he said. "I am not going to tell Rick Grimes." Her breathing was very shallow. "I don't know what you—" "I need you to deliver a message to the governor," Kraven said. Tell him I have agreed to help Rick's people defend the prison. And tell him I am training their fighters. Tell him I have identified 3 structural weaknesses in the southern perimeter, and that I am working to address them." He paused. "Tell him the prison will be significantly harder to take in 3 weeks than it is today." Clara stared at him. Her face moved through several things before settling on something that wasn't quite understanding but was adjacent to it. "You want him to move sooner?" "I want him to make a decision based on incomplete information under time pressure," Kraven said. "Decisions made that way carry predictable errors. Predictable errors can be prepared for." "If he attacks and people die," she started. "People will die regardless," Kraven said, with a flatness that was not cruelty but was close enough to it that the distinction required careful examination. "The question is which people, and how many, and whether the ones who survive have a future worth the price of the ones who don't." He held her eyes. "Deliver the message. After the attack, if you want to leave Woodbury, come to the north fence and ask for me." He walked away from her without looking back, which was a calculated choice. Turning your back on someone you'd just coerced was either foolish or a statement of absolute confidence, and in this case it was both. And he knew it, and he spent the rest of the day with the knowledge sitting in his chest like a stone he'd chosen to swallow. That evening, Rick found him at the eastern fence line watching a distant tree line where something large moved through the underbrush. Deer, Kraven had determined, an actual living deer, which felt almost miraculous in this landscape. "You've been quiet," Rick said. "I have been thinking." "About Woodbury?" Kraven watched the deer's passage through the trees. The particular aliveness of it, the way it moved with the full biological commitment of a creature that still had genuine reasons to survive. "About the cost of protecting things you did not choose to protect," he said, "and whether the choosing comes after the cost or before it." Rick was quiet beside him for a moment. The deer disappeared into the darkness between the pines. "Usually after," Rick said. "In my experience." Kraven said nothing. The stone in his chest did not get lighter, but he had not expected it to. Daryl Dixon had been hunting since he was 6 years old. Not in the way that men with money hunted, driven to a blind, handed a rifle, he'd given a clear shot at a 12-point buck that had been half-tamed by a season of feed corn, and was therefore less a wild animal than an expensive domestic one wearing antlers. Daryl had learned to hunt from Merle, which meant he'd learned in the way that left marks, going out before sunrise into the Georgia woods with whatever was available and coming back with something, or going hungry, which was not a metaphor but a literal operational parameter of his childhood. He'd learned to read track sign before he could read sentences. He'd learned to move through brush without sound before he understood why silence mattered to adults. He'd learned patience the way you learn patience when impatience means an empty stomach, which is the only school that produces the genuine article. He recognized Kraven the way a dog recognizes another dog, not through any cognitive process, but through something older and more reliable, the specific frequency that predators broadcast to each other across species lines. What he hadn't decided yet was whether that recognition was the beginning of respect or the beginning of a problem. The confrontation happened on a Friday morning, which Daryl would later reflect was appropriate since Fridays, in the old world, had always carried the particular energy of things that had been building all week, finally arriving at their natural conclusion. He'd been tracking a small walker cluster that had drifted into the field east of the prison, 4 of them, moving in the loose aggregation that passed for herding behavior among the dead. And he was moving through the tall grass in the deliberate sideways drift that kept him downwind and below the sight line when he became aware, with the specific prickling certainty of a man whose instincts had been calibrated by 2 years of apocalypse survival, that he was being followed. He stopped, let the grass settle around him, listened. Nothing. Which was itself the tell. The Georgia field in early autumn was full of sound, insects and wind, and the small constant percussion of living things going about their business. And the cone of silence behind him had the precise shape of something very large moving very carefully. Yet Daryl spun and brought the crossbow up in a single motion that he'd performed 10,000 times, and which had become as involuntary as breathing. Kraven stood 8 feet behind him in the tall grass, hands open at his sides, with the expression of a man who had been caught doing something he considered entirely reasonable and was prepared to defend that position. "You've been following me since the east gate," Daryl said. "Since the inner fence," Kraven corrected, with the mild precision of someone for whom accuracy was a reflex. "I was curious about your method. Your track reading is excellent. Your downwind approach was textbook. Your decision to take the 4 as a group rather than separating them first was either confident or careless. I haven't determined which yet." Daryl kept the crossbow level. "You want to find out which? You can come at me and see." Something moved in Kraven's dark eyes. Not amusement exactly, but the closest thing to it that his particular architecture seemed capable of producing. "I don't want to fight you, Dixon." "Then why are you following me?" "Because you are the only person in this prison who moves through the world the way I move through it," Kraven said, and I wanted to understand whether that was genuine or performed. The crossbow didn't waver. Daryl studied him over the bolt, reading the stance, the weight distribution, the specific quality of stillness that Kraven projected, which was not the stillness of a man waiting to defend himself, but the stillness of a man who had simply decided that the outcome of the next 30 seconds was not a matter requiring anxiety. "It's genuine," Daryl said. "I know," Kraven said. "I determined that approximately 4 minutes into following you. The rest was appreciation." Daryl lowered the crossbow by 3 inches, which was not a gesture of trust, but was a gesture of provisional non-hostility. And in his personal vocabulary, those were meaningfully different things. "You track walkers every morning," he said. "I've seen you. You're not doing it for the kill. No, you're looking for something." "I am always looking for something," Kraven said. "In this world I have found very few candidates." He paused. "You are one of them." It was the kind of statement that would have made most men uncomfortable, delivered with the directness of a professional assessment rather than any emotional appeal. Daryl processed it the way he processed most things, without visible reaction, filing it somewhere useful. "Yep, the governor's coming," Daryl said. It was not a question. Kraven was quiet for a half-second that told Daryl everything about what Kraven knew and hadn't yet said. "Yes. You knew before today." Another half-second. "Yes." Daryl's jaw tightened. "And you didn't tell Rick." "I am managing the approach vector," Kraven said. "If Rick knows and prepares visibly, the governor adjusts. If the governor believes he has the element of surprise, he commits to a plan built on that belief. Plans built on false premises have predictable failure points." "People could die because of what you're managing," Daryl said, and his voice had the flat iron quality it got when he was at the outer edge of what he would tolerate. "People will die," Kraven said. "I am attempting to determine which people and in what number. Or I understand you find the calculus unacceptable. I am not asking you to find it acceptable." They stood in the tall grass with the 4 walkers drifting 30 meters away, oblivious, and Daryl looked at Kraven with the specific expression of a man who understood something he wished he didn't. You need to tell Rick today, Daryl said. All of it. What you know and what you did. Yes, Kraven agreed. I intended to. When? When I had determined that you would be in the room when I did. He held Daryl's eyes steadily. Rick will want to act immediately on instinct. You will want to evaluate the tactical logic before reacting. The combination of those two responses is what the situation requires. Separately, either one makes a significant error. Daryl stared at him for a long moment. You planned this, Daryl said. Following me. On this whole conversation. I evaluated the optimal conditions for a necessary disclosure, Kraven said. I then created those conditions. That's the same thing. Yes, Kraven said simply. It is. The four walkers had drifted another 10 meters closer, drawn by something neither man had consciously produced. The specific atmospheric disturbance of two predators occupying the same space and taking each other's full measure. Daryl looked at them, then back at Kraven, and made the particular decision that his particular life had made him capable of making. Come on, he said, turning back toward the prison. And Dixon, Kraven said behind him. Daryl stopped. Your method with the four? It was confident, not careless. A pause. There is a difference between the two that matters in this world, and you have always known which side of it you stand on. Daryl said nothing, but he didn't dispute it either, which was its own kind of answer. Rick took it the way Kraven had predicted he would take it. The first 30 seconds were very quiet, which was more alarming than noise would have been. Rick Grimes going quiet was not the quiet of a man processing information, but the quiet of a man applying extraordinary conscious pressure to his own instincts, holding them down with both hands while the more functional part of his mind caught up. His jaw set. His right hand moved to his python and stopped short of the grip, which was not a threat but a habit. The physical manifestation of a man whose stress response had been rewired by 2 years of crises that rewarded immediate decisive violence. Then he looked at Daryl. Daryl gave him the slight chin lift that meant hear it out, and Rick breathed once through his nose and turned back to Kraven. Tell me everything, he said. From the beginning. Nothing managed, nothing edited. Everything. Kraven told him. He did it with the precise, comprehensive economy of a man delivering a field report. Woodbury's preparation indicators, the timeline estimate, the informant he'd identified, the message he'd sent through her, the tactical logic underlying each decision. He presented it without apology and without the defensive framing that guilty men used when confessing to things they knew would land badly. He had made the choices he'd made for the reasons he'd made them, and he was prepared to stand in front of those reasons without decorating them. When he finished, the room held a silence with genuine weight. Herschel spoke first, from his chair by the window where he'd been listening with his eyes half closed in the way he had when he was thinking hardest. You used Clara without her full understanding of the risk. Yes, Kraven said. She could be killed when the governor realizes she passed bad intelligence. I told her to come to the north fence after the attack. I intend to honor that. Your intention doesn't protect her between now and then, Herschel said, not with anger, but with the measured moral weight of a man who had spent a lifetime as the conscience in rooms that needed one. No, Kraven agreed. It does not. Rick had moved to the window during this exchange and was standing with his back to the room looking out at the yard where Carl was helping Michonne repair a section of inner fence. Here the two of them working with the focused physicality of people who process difficulty through their hands. He watched his son for a moment with the expression fathers get when the world's actual stakes become suddenly, viscerally specific. 2 weeks, Rick said. Maybe sooner. The message Clara carries suggests urgency. If the governor believes I am strengthening your defenses, he will want to move before that work is complete. I estimate he accelerates by 4 to 7 days. So we have a week, possibly less. Possibly less, Kraven confirmed. What followed was 3 hours of the most functionally brutal planning session Kraven had observed since arriving in this world. Rick moved through the prison's defensive realities with the systematic grimness of a man who had stopped flinching at hard truths because flinching cost time he didn't have. He cataloged their ammunition with Daryl. Specific counts, specific calibers, specific positions for maximum coverage of the approach corridors the governor's vehicles would have to use. He talked to Michonne about the outer perimeter's weak points with the directness of two people who had moved past the stage of softening difficult information for each other. He sat with Herschel and Glenn and Carol and talked about the people who couldn't fight and where they needed to be and what the evacuation route looked like if the walls failed. He did not talk to Kraven during any of this. That was also information. Late in the afternoon, when the planning had reached the stage where individual tasks had been assigned and people had dispersed to begin executing them, Rick found Kraven on the catwalk above the main block, looking out over the field where the mist was beginning to gather again in the low places as the temperature dropped. "I need to know something," Rick said. "Ask." "When you made the decision to use Clara, to run your own operation inside my walls without telling me, did you consider that I might throw you out for it?" Kraven looked at him. "Yes." "And you did it anyway?" "Yes." Rick leaned on the railing beside him, not looking at him, looking out at the field. "Why?" "Because the tactical logic was sound regardless of the personal cost," Kraven said. I have spent my life making decisions whose logic I could defend, even when the decisions themselves were difficult to stand inside." He paused. "I am not accustomed to being accountable to anyone for those decisions. I am adjusting to the experience." "Adjusting," Rick repeated, with a flatness that contained something that might, under other circumstances, have been dry humor. "It is not a natural state for me," Kraven said. Rick was quiet for a moment. Below them, the prison went about the accelerated, purposeful business of people who knew something was coming and had chosen to meet it on their feet. Carol was organizing the non-combatants with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything, since the world had forced her to discover what she actually was. Glenn was moving ammunition crates with the focused energy of a man converting anxiety into productive labor. Beth was with the children, her voice carrying up to the catwalk in fragments, something with a melody, something that insisted on gentleness even now. "You're going to fight with us," Rick said. It was not a question. "Yes?" "Because you ran an operation that made this attack more likely to happen on our terms." "Partially. What's the other part?" Kraven watched the mist thicken in the field's low places, swallowing the dead grass in slow white increments. "When I arrived in this world, I believed there was nothing in it worth the effort of remaining," he said. "I have revised that assessment." Rick looked at him then, directly, and with the evaluating honesty that was his most consistent quality, the look of a man who had learned to read people by necessity and had gotten very good at it. "The governor," Rick said. "You want him. He is a predator who has confused dominance over the weak for mastery of the strong," Kraven said. "That is a philosophical error, I find." He paused, choosing the word with care. "Instructive to correct." "I need him stopped," Rick said. "Not corrected, stopped." "In this case," Kraven said, "those are the same thing." Rick pushed off the railing and headed for the stairs. He stopped at the top step and looked back. And what was in his face was not trust exactly. Trust was something Rick Grimes extended in careful, measured increments earned over time. But it was the acknowledgement of a man who had decided to bet on the hand he'd been dealt, because folding wasn't an option. "Don't make decisions inside my walls without telling me again," he said. "No," Kraven said. Rick went down the stairs. Kraven stayed on the catwalk while the mist consumed the field entirely, and somewhere in the white distance the dead moved through it like memories of men. And he stood there until the cold came in properly, and the prison's lights came on one by one against the dark. Each small yellow window a declaration of stubborn, continued existence against a world that had stopped deserving it. They came on a Sunday. Kraven had expected Sunday. Or there was a specific psychology to the governor's theatrical sensibility that made the symbolic weight of a Sunday assault appealing. The day that had once meant rest and safety and community, weaponized into its opposite. Philip Blake was a man who understood that destruction lands hardest when it arrives wearing the clothes of something familiar. They came with 3 vehicles and 43 men, which Kraven had estimated within 4 of the actual number, and they came from the south and west simultaneously, which was the tactically logical approach, and therefore the one Rick had spent the most time preparing for. The lead vehicle was a truck with a reinforced plow welded to the front, designed to breach the outer fence in a single sustained push. and behind it came two military surplus transports packed with armed men who would pour through the breach before the prison's defenders could reposition from the watchtowers. It was a competent plan. Against the prison Rick had been running 3 weeks ago, it would likely have worked. Kraven was in the tree line 200 meters south of the approach road when the convoy passed, moving through the pre-dawn dark with the suppressed urgency of men who believed they had surprise on their side. He watched them pass with the hunter's absolute stillness, cataloging the force, confirming the numbers, locating the governor's position, third vehicle, passenger side, the particular quality of stillness behind the glass that distinguished a commander from a soldier. He let them pass and moved parallel through the trees. The first explosion was Rick's, a length of chain threaded through the outer fence and attached to a concrete anchor buried 6 feet deep, invisible from the approach road, which caught the plow truck's reinforced bumper and stopped it with a shriek of tearing metal 40 feet short of the fence line. The truck's engine screamed, and the wheels spun in the red Georgia clay, and the men in the transports behind it had approximately 4 seconds of confused inertia before the prison's watchtowers opened up with everything Rick's people had saved and rationed and counted for exactly this moment. Those 4 seconds were Kraven's window. He came out of the tree line at a dead run, not toward the vehicles but toward the ditch on the road's eastern shoulder, where 3 of the governor's men had been positioned as a flanking element. Their job to circle wide during the frontal confusion and breach the prison's eastern fence while the defenders were occupied with the main assault. Kraven had identified their staging position the previous afternoon by the specific compression pattern their boots had left in the soft ground during their reconnaissance, and he had spent the intervening hours constructing 3 snares along the approach path that would not kill them but would stop them long enough for what came next. The first 2 were tangled before they understood what was happening. The third turned and ran directly into Kraven, which was its own kind of snare. The fight lasted 11 seconds, yet Kraven was not gentle with it. Gentleness was not a concept that applied to the space between a man and 3 armed opponents in a roadside ditch in the dark. But he was precise, which was a different and more useful quality. 3 men breathing but no longer relevant to the next 30 minutes. He stripped their weapons and zip-tied their wrists with the plastic restraints he'd taken from the prison's supply room 3 days ago without asking, because asking would have required explaining, and explaining would have cost time. Then he turned toward the main road and went to find the governor. Philip Blake had exited the 3rd vehicle when the chain stopped the plow truck, which Kraven had also predicted. The governor was not the kind of man who stayed behind cover during a setback, because staying behind cover acknowledged the setback as significant, and Philip Blake's authority rested on the performance of invulnerability. He was standing in the road with 4 personal guards, radio in hand, his single eye reading the situation with the rapid, cold intelligence of a man recalculating in real time. He saw Kraven coming from 60 meters away, and Kraven watched him process it. The lone figure emerging from the tree line at a pace that was not running exactly, but was something more purposeful than walking. The specific directional commitment of an object in motion that has identified its destination. The governor said something to his guards. 2 of them moved to intercept, so Kraven went through the first one with a shoulder check that redirected the man's own momentum into the ditch, with enough force to remove him from the equation without requiring a second engagement. The second he caught by the forearm as the rifle came up, controlled the weapon's barrel outward, and put the man down with a knee strike that had the anatomical precision of someone who had studied exactly how much force that particular joint could absorb. The remaining 2 guards raised their weapons. "Philip," Kraven said, stopping 12 feet from the governor. The governor looked at him across the space between them with his one eye and the expression of a man doing very rapid arithmetic. The radio crackled in his hand. His men at the fence encountering Rick's prepared defense, the watchtower fire, the chain stopping the plow truck, or the flanking element gone silent. The arithmetic was not resolving in his favor, and he knew it, and Kraven could see him knowing it, which was its own form of revelation. "You did this," the governor said. Not with anger, with the flat recognition of a man identifying a variable he'd miscalculated. "I accelerated your timeline," Kraven said. "You did the rest." "I could have used you," the governor said. "I told you that." "You told me many things," Kraven said. Most of them were true in the way that half-truths are true, accurately describing the surface while concealing the structure beneath it. He took 1 step forward. The 2 guards tracked him, He paid them the minimal attention their actual threat level warranted. You told me you were an ecologist, that the strong define terms for the weak, that this is nature's order. Another step. But ecology requires that predators maintain the health of the ecosystem. You are not maintaining anything, you are consuming it. The governor's remaining eye was very still. And you're going to stop me. I am going to give you the opportunity to understand what you are, Kraven said, before the understanding is no longer available to you. What happened next was fast in the way that violence between two genuinely dangerous men is always fast, compressed, total, without the theatrical pacing that movies had taught people to expect from such moments. The governor moved first, which surprised Kraven slightly and elevated his estimation of the man by a corresponding degree. Reaching not for the radio but for the knife at his hip, a moving with the practical economy of someone who had been in enough fights to know that speeches end and blades begin. The blade was good. The technique behind it was better than Kraven had expected. Not trained, exactly, but experienced, sharpened by necessity into something genuinely dangerous. The governor's first strike opened a line across Kraven's forearm that would need cleaning and would scar, and his second came within 4 inches of something that would have mattered. Then Kraven had his wrist. The fight's remainder was approximately 8 seconds of physics, the application of superior leverage, positioning, and the specific knowledge of human anatomy that Kraven had spent 30 years accumulating against a man who was formidable but not, in the final calculation, in Kraven's category. The governor went down hard, a face against the red Georgia clay, Kraven's knee in his back, the knife gone into the ditch somewhere. Around them, the assault was collapsing, Rick's defense holding, the flanking element neutralized, the governor's men losing the conviction that tended to evaporate quickly when the man they followed was no longer visibly winning. Kraven looked down at the governor, who was breathing in the controlled, deliberate way of a man refusing to show pain, his one eye finding Kraven's with the last available instrument of defiance. "Finish it," the governor said. Quiet, steady. Whatever else Philip Blake was, he did not beg. Kraven studied him for a long moment. The man beneath the performance, the genuine predator that the performance had been built around and had ultimately corrupted. He felt the specific gravitational pull of completion, the hunter's ancient imperative toward resolution. "No," he said. He stood, stepped back, and let Rick's people, who had come through the outer gate during the final moments of the fight, take the governor into custody with the grim, purposeful efficiency of people who'd been waiting a long time for this particular morning to arrive. The cut on his forearm bled steadily into the cold dawn air, and Kraven looked at it with something that was not quite satisfaction, but was the closest available approximation. The specific quality of a hunt that had cost something real, which was the only kind worth remembering. The aftermath of violence has its own weather. Kraven had observed this across 30 years and 6 continents. The particular atmospheric pressure that settles over a place where something irreversible has happened. The way people move through it differently than they move through ordinary air, slower and more deliberate, as though the ground itself has changed composition underfoot. The prison's yard had that quality in the hours after the governor's assault collapsed, the surviving defenders moving through the cold morning light with the specific exhaustion of people who had spent enormous reserves of something that wasn't purely physical and were now taking inventory of what remained. 2 people had died. A man named Zach, who had been on the western watchtower when the assault began, caught by the initial exchange of fire before Rick's chain stopped the plow truck. A woman named Anna, who had been part of the outer fence defense and had gone down in the confused minutes before the governor's men broke and ran. Kraven did not know either of them well. He had not been at the prison long enough to know anyone well, but he stood at the back of the group that gathered in the yard when Rick said their names aloud, and he felt the weight of those names in the way he had not expected to feel it. He was still feeling it when Daryl found him at the eastern fence an hour later. "Governor's secured," Daryl said, settling beside him with the economical physicality that characterized everything Dixon did. Rick's got him in a cell block. Michonne's, processing her feelings about that situation. "He should be watched carefully," Kraven said. "Philip Blake is most dangerous when he appears most contained." "Rick knows." Daryl was quiet for a moment. Aim his eyes on the middle distance where a thin line of walkers moved along the tree line with their characteristic purposeless persistence. 2 people died today? Yes. Your play with Clara, moving his timeline up, you think that changed the number? Craven considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which meant sitting inside it rather than reaching immediately for the answer that absolved him. I believe the number would have been higher under a fully prepared assault, he said. I cannot prove that. The counterfactual is not available for examination. He paused. I know that Zach was on the western tower and Anna was on the outer fence, and that both positions were strengthened in the days I gave Rick by accelerating the governor's timeline. And I know that the flanking element I neutralized was targeting the cell block where the children were sheltered. He stopped. I do not know if that arithmetic justifies the method. I know that the method was the one I chose, and that I will carry it accordingly. Daryl looked at him with the sideways attention he gave things he was taking seriously. That's an honest answer. I am trying to practice honesty in this world, Kraven said. It is more difficult than it appears. Daryl almost smiled. It was a minimal expression, barely a shift in the set of his jaw, but on Daryl Dixon's face it constituted significant emotional output. Yeah, he said. It is. Rick came to find Kraven as the afternoon light was failing. He walking with the loose-jointed tiredness of a man whose body had spent everything it had and was now operating on the narrative momentum of responsibility. The particular animation that kept leaders upright after battles, because the people around them needed them upright. He had cleaned the blood from his hands, but his shirt still carried the morning's work in dark patches along the sleeve. He sat down on the concrete beside Kraven without preamble and looked at the yard where Carl and Michonne were doing the last walkthrough of the outer fence, checking the chain's damage, assessing what the next day's repair work would require. Woodbury's people, Rick said, the ones who didn't run, there are 11 of them. Disarmed, he's sitting in the east block. What will you do with them? I don't know yet. Rick picked up a piece of loose concrete from the ground and turned it in his fingers. Some of them were there by choice. Some of them were there because leaving was more dangerous than staying. He paused. It's hard to know which is which. It is always hard to know which is which, Kraven said. That difficulty is not a reason to stop trying to determine it. Rick looked at him. You're staying. It was not a question, but it was not entirely a statement either. It occupied the space between, where things that needed to be said aloud lived in order to become real. For now, Kraven said. What does that mean for a man like you? Kraven was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the afternoon light move across the prison yard in long amber panels, yet catching the fence wire in brief gold before releasing it to the early dark. He thought about the stone circle north of Nairobi, and the corrupted route and the way the world had opened without ceremony or explanation, and deposited him here, in Georgia, in the end of everything, among people who woke up every morning and chose to continue in a world that had given them comprehensive reasons not to. It means I have not yet found the edge of what this place requires of me, he said. When I do, I will know whether to stay past it. Rick nodded, slowly, the nod of a man who understood incompleteness in answers because he lived inside incompleteness in everything. He stood, pocketed the concrete fragment with the absent habit of a man who collected small things without knowing why, and looked down at Kraven with the honest, evaluating directness that was his most consistent quality. The 2 people we lost today, Rick said. They matter, whatever the arithmetic says. I know, Kraven said. That is, he paused, finding the words for something he had not previously needed language for. That is a new knowledge. I am still learning its shape. Rick left him there as the dark came fully in and the prison's lights came on against it, each small window burning with the stubborn insistence of people who had decided that light was worth the effort of maintaining. Kraven sat at the eastern fence while the cold settled into the yard and the walkers moved in the middle distance and the prison breathed around him with the specific living sound of 41 people, 39 now, none of the arithmetic always running, going about the irreducible business of surviving another day. His forearm ached where the governor's blade had opened it. He was glad of the ache. Somewhere in the secured cell block, Philip Blake sat in the dark with his one eye and his calculations, and whatever he was planning next had already begun. In Woodbury, leaderless, the remaining population was making decisions that would send ripples outward in ways that no one had yet mapped. And somewhere beyond the tree line, beyond the walker's endless patient drift, beyond the borders of any map Kraven had ever carried, the world kept ending in all the ways it had been ending since the first dead man stood up and walked toward the warmth of the living. Kraven the hunter remained at the fence, watching the dark, I neither at rest nor at readiness, but in the particular state between them that has no clean name. The state of a man who has found, against every expectation, something worth watching over, and is not yet sure what to do with the finding. The dead moved through the tree line, the prison lights held against the dark. And winter, in its way, was always coming. Sergei Kravenov had crossed the world in search of worthy prey and found instead something he had no category for. A community of people choosing dignity in a world that had made dignity structurally irrational. He had made hard choices inside their walls and stood in front of those choices without flinching, paid for them in the currency of two names he would not forget, and discovered in the process that accountability was its own form of strength, an unfamiliar and uncomfortable and more demanding than anything the hunt had ever asked of him. The governor breathed in a cell block and planned with the patience of a man who understood that captured was not finished. Woodbury's leaderless remnant would coalesce around something. It always did. The walkers accumulated beyond the fence in numbers that the winter cold slowed but did not stop. And somewhere in the weirwood network of this broken world, forces larger than any single prison or any single man moved toward configurations that no one inside those lit windows could yet see clearly. Kraven had arrived in a dead world looking for something worth hunting. He had found instead something worth protecting, and whether those two things would eventually require the same actions, whether the hunter's skills and the guardian's purpose could occupy the same man without one consuming the other, was a question this world would answer in its own time and on its own terms. He had learned in his weeks among Rick Grimes's people that the worthy hunt was never the one you expected. The name Kravenov would endure in this world. What it would come to mean was still being written,